Hi everyone, it's Kathy. Thank you so much for joining me. Today I'll be creating this Slimline card using the Critter Costume Party stamp set by Not Too Shabby, the Cloud and Grass Edgers die from Whimsy Stamps, as well as the Slimline Card Builder die from Whimsy Stamps. I really wanted to create a night sky for Halloween, but I wanted to try different colors. I didn't want to use the traditional blues and purples. I cut a mask using a circle die so that I could place that in the center of my card panel. Then I started out with dried marigold Distress Oxide ink, and when I started to blend that ink onto my panel, I started on the mask first and moved out to the cardstock just to make sure that it didn't get kind of blotchy right around the rim of the moon. Then I came in with carved pumpkin and added more of that further out. I did go over the dried marigold a little bit, but I really want to make sure that I leave that nice brighter highlight right outside of the moon. While I'm doing the ink blending, which obviously I'm using a makeup blending brush, I am kind of going in a semicircle shape just so that the glow from the moon looks like it's getting darker the further away it gets. After the carved pumpkin, I came in with Rusty Hinge. I did go over this quite a few times just to make sure that I got a really nice blend, particularly between the carved pumpkin and the Rusty Hinge. And then to brighten it up even more directly outside my mask, I did come back in with the dried marigold. Then I came in with black soot and went right around the very outer edges, and then I did a very tiny little bit across the very top of the cardstock. And when I did that, I was starting on my work surface and just barely pressing down when I got to the very top of the cardstock. After I was done with the black soot, I did come back in with the Rusty Hinge to get a smoother blend between the black soot and the Rusty Hinge. Then I added a little bit more carved pumpkin to smooth out that line. And then I added just a tad bit more of the dried marigold. After I was done with the ink blending, I removed the mask for the moon, and then I put the negative mask down to make sure that I'd stayed within that circle and didn't get out into that dried marigold ink. I definitely wanted to have separation between the yellow and the orange. After I was done ink blending the moon, I brought in my C1 marker and started to add in some shadows and craters on my moon. For the craters of the moon, I literally just did scribbles. I didn't overthink it. I just started adding them in until I was happy with how they looked. I wanted to add in a few more craters, but I didn't want them to be as dark, so I brought in my C0 so that I could add them in a little bit higher. And then I did use the C0 to go over the C1. Once I was done with the markers, I did go over the moon again with the Squeezed Lemonade Distress Oxide ink. After I was done with that, I put the mask back over the moon so I could add some white splatters with some white ink. After I added in the splatters, I set that panel off to the side to dry, and then I started working on coloring in my little images. Now I stamped the bee a number of times because I had a different idea in mind, and then I switched midway. I'm only going to share how I colored two of the bees, even though I only end up using one in my final card. But I did save the other bees for another card that I have an idea for. Anyway, I started out with BG72 for the face of the bee. Since she's wearing a witch hat, I thought it would be cute to paint her face green like the witch from The Wizard of Oz. After the BG72, I blended that out with YG11, and I made sure to leave a highlight in the center of her face. And then I blended that out with the BG90. I let that ink settle in a little bit, and I am going to come back and darken up some of those shadows. That is one thing about the Cougar Super Smooth cardstock, is sometimes it takes a while for the ink to dry on it because it's so absorbent, and you can tell if your ink is still wet if when you touch the area that you just colored feels cold to the touch, your ink is still wet. So knowing that, I moved on and started coloring the hat. I started with V15 and added that on the outer edges, and then I added tiny little notches where there's kind of a wrinkle drawn in on the witch hat. Then I blended that out with V12, and then I came in with V09 just to darken up the outer edges of the hat. And then I blended that out with the V15 and the V12 one more time. For the body of the bee, I started out with BV25 and I concentrated that on the outer edges of the stripes on the body so that I could maintain the center highlight. After the BV25, I finished coloring in those stripes with BV23. And then for the yellow stripes, I started with Y08 and again concentrated that on the outer edges of the stripes, leaving a center highlight, and then filled in the center with Y06. For the wings of the bee, I started out with BG000, and I added that where it was closest to the bee's body, but I left it white up around the outer edges of the wings. Then I added in some YG00, and then I blended it out again with the BG000. And here I come back in with the BG72 to darken up some of the shadows on the face of the bee, particularly underneath the rim of the hat and on the outer edges. Then I did another blend with the YG11 and a tiny little bit of the BG90 in the center of her little face. Moving right along, I stamped the sloth, the llama, and the two bunnies, and I don't think I mentioned it, but I did use Memento Tuxedo black ink to stamp the images, and I stamped them all onto Cougar Super Smooth cardstock. To color the sloth, I started out with E27 and added that around the areas where they would be the darkest, on the outer part of his arms and his face, and then underneath his, I guess, well, I don't know if it's a muzzle, but I'm going to call it a muzzle because the very front of his face will be a little bit lighter. After the E27, I blended that out with E55, and I blended that out a little bit more with the E35 and E34, again leaving a nice center highlight on his tummy and his arms, and then I blended all of that out with E31. For his muzzle, I used E53 and E51, and I concentrated the E53 around his little mask and around the outer edges of his face. Again, I'm trying to keep a bright center highlight for these little guys. For the little nose on the sloth, I colored that in with E29. Moving on to his mask and his little cape, I used the same colors as I did for the witch hat. I started with V09 and added that where it would be the darkest around the outer edges and closest to his body, and for his mask on the very outer part of his face. I blended that out with V15, and then I finished coloring in with V12. For his mask, I decided that it should be a little bit darker in the center by his nose, so I did add a little bit of the V09 in that area. Moving on to coloring in the llama, I wanted his fur to have a whole bunch of texture, so I didn't do any flicking motion at all on his main body. I started out with E43 and literally just did squiggle marks. The technical term I do believe is called scumbling, but scribble marks, scumbling, it's all the same. After that, I came in with E42 and I added in more squiggle marks, and I tried to make sure that I didn't go over the E43 too much because I didn't want to lose that texture. Then I came in with E41 and continued with the scribble marks and filled in the white space. For his hoofs, I used E44. They're pretty small, so one color was enough for me on that one. And for his face, I colored it in with E41. And then to add just a little bit of shading around the fur line around his face, I came in with E53 and then blended that out again with E41. For the insides of his ears, I used R20. For the ghost bunny, I started out with E43 and added that at the bottom of his ears that are right next to the sheet, and kind of went up a little bit, making sure to leave some white space so I could blend it out with the E42. And I did the same thing with his paws and his feet. I concentrated the E43 closest to his little costume and left some white space so I could have some highlight on the top of his foot and at the very top of his little paws. To color in his costume, I started out with C5 and I used it very, very sparingly. What I wanted to do with the C5 was highlight where the wrinkles were in the sheet itself, so I added that on those drawn lines that were already there for me, and I did extend them a little bit further than the drawn line. Then I came in with C3 and extended the C5 out a little bit, and I did add some of the C3 to one side or the other of the C5. I blended all of that out with the C1, but I made sure not to color in the whole sheet because I did want it to look more white than gray. After I was done with the C1, I did come in with a colorless blender and just did a pretty quick swipe to blend out some of the harsher lines. For the insides of his ears, I started with R20 and I concentrated that right next to the line where his outer ear is. And then I blended that out with R00. Sorry about that. For the little bunny with the witch shoes, I used the same colors. I started with E43, but to color in her ears, I started at the top of her ears and flicked down, and then I went down to the bottom of the ear and flicked up and made sure that I left some nice white space between the top and the bottom. I also added it around her little face and her I don't know, is that a muzzle? I'm going to call it a muzzle. And then on the outer edges of her body, then I came in with E42 and filled in the rest of her ears and blended out a little bit on her face, making sure to leave quite a bit of white space above her muzzle, just so I could have that center highlight. And then I colored her muzzle in completely with the E41. I used R20 for her nose, and for the insides of her ears, I did the same thing. I concentrated that closest to the line of the outer part of her ear, and then I blended that out with R00. For her little boots and the flower on her head, I used the same purples. I started with V09 and added that around the outer edges of her boots. I blended that out with the V15 and then the V12. I colored the heels in with C5. And then for the flower on her head, I started with the V09 and concentrated that in the center of the flower. I blended that out with the V12, leaving quite a bit of white space on the outer edges of those petals, and blended all of that out with the V12 marker. After I was done coloring in the images, I did run them through my brother's scan and cut machine so that they could be cut out. Off camera, I had used the Grassy Edgers die and cut 2 pieces from black cardstock. And that black cardstock, you guys, is like the Cadillac of black cardstock. I will make sure to link to that as well as everything else that I used in the description box below. It is the deepest black cardstock that I found, and it's a very heavy weight. I totally love it. Anyway, I had die cut the grassy edger hills, and I used liquid glue to adhere it to my ink blended panel. And then I used the Slimline card builder die and ran that through my Gemini Junior to cut out the whole panel. I wanted to have the stitching to continue around the bottom of the grassy edgers. Next, I adhered that ink blended panel to a Slimline card, and my card base started out at 8.5 by 7 inches, and I scored it at 3.5 inches. So my finished card is 3.5 inches by 8.5 inches. I did put a bunch of foam tape on the back of my little critters and added them to the front of the card. I played around with the position of the little critters a little bit, and once I was happy with where they were at, then I pressed down to make sure that they stuck really well. To finish it up, I added a little bit of glitter to the wings of the bee, the flower and boots of the bunny, and then I decided to add some sparkle to the witch hat on the bee, and of course the spider web on the llama. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.